Loophole dodging is an integral part of motorsport, and when it's done correctly it can yield some results so great that loopholes are shut immediately to stop things getting out of control. Such loopholes include the double diffuser on the Braun, Williams and Toyota cars of 2009, the blown diffusers that replaced them, and Smoky Unique adding an extra 60 feet or so of fuel line so we can carry more fuel in the car. But one that I find genuinely interesting is how Dauer managed to exploit the rulebook at the 1994 24 Hours of Le Mans. The Porsche 962 was already a legend. It ran in IMSA's GTP category in America and also in Group C over here in Europe. It replaced the equally legendary 956 that ran between 1982 and 1985, and it's in that 956 that Stefan Beloff set his mythical lap time around the Nordschleife, a lap record that will never be beaten in a competition car. That is, unless VLN goes, "Hey, sure, why not, let's have LMP2s or LMHC run around the Nordschleife next season." Or if GT3 suddenly gains many downforces and horsepowers. But saying that, development on the 962 had started in 1981 because the 956 was banned in America. The reason it was banned is because the driver's feet were ahead of the front axle, something that was still happening in Formula 1 but was changed after the 1986 British Grand Prix. So the key changes from the 956 to the 962 were that the wheelbase was lengthened to allow the pedals to be behind the front axle, and a steel roll cage was added under the aluminium body. It also had a single turbocharger hooked up to a new 2.8 litre flat 6 because twin turbos weren't allowed in IMSA at that time. They did, however, build a twin turbo 2.8, 3 and 3.2 litre engine for use in Group C, but in 1987 the 3.2 fuel injected engine they brought in for 1985 was then banned under IMSA regulations. But what was cool about the 962, and I don't know if Porsche intended for this or not, is that a lot of privateer teams who bought one of the cars would do their own improvements and modifications in order to stay competitive. Some re-engineered the entire car, like design a new chassis completely and then place the existing bodywork on top. Or they would design all new bodywork for aerodynamic efficiency, and I'm not sure if Porsche really cared as long as their car was doing well or they were selling cars, either or. And then those privately modified 962s were sold on to other privateer teams in some cases, buy Porsche, modify, sell, question marks, profit. Kramer and Jost, they did it in Europe, and a couple of teams in IMSA did it as well. And while it didn't have the same dominance the 956 did in 1982, the nobody's perfect advertising poster that Porsche did at that time, which I still need to get on a t-shirt by the way, the 962 was still a very good car and very sought after by customer teams. It won IMSA 3 years running, it won regional championships, it won in Japan, it won at Le Mans, it won the World Sports Car Championship. TLDR, if it was in it, it won it. But towards the end of the Group C era, Jaguar, Mazda, Toyota and Mercedes all came along, and the privateer 962s became less competitive. So was it because the car was so good, or was it because there wasn't any competition? I'm going to leave that to you to decide. And the 962 would continue to win races in IMSA, but over here in 1992, Group C endurance effectively ended, and the World Sports Car Championship died. I did do a video called Mulsanne Monsters a couple of years ago, which I might revisit soon as more and more information becomes available between making those kinds of videos and now, and it pretty much involves a Mr. Bernard Eccleston, but like I say, it's another video entirely. It's also thought that what Bernie did to Group C he tried to do to DTM, but let's be honest, DTM did that all to itself. Twice. I've just seen that Nico's no-nosing it down here. That's funny. So after the Manicure round of the 1992 World Sports Car Championship, the series died with a whimper, after what I've referred to multiple times now as a Guns N' Roses concert at 200 miles an hour. The 1992 24 Hours of Le Mans was probably the lowest number of entries on record, as only 21 cars turned up. But the top two categories were the same as they were in 1991 when Mazda won it. C1, which was the new 3.5 litre engine formula that copied Formula 1, and C2, which was real Group C. And to make sure they had an event in 1993, they allowed the same cars again. For 1994 though, the ACO did some other bits and pieces. They continued to work closely with IMSA, and both series drew up some regulations for new categories. The ACO, which ran Le Mans, came up with Le Mans Prototype, which allowed open cockpit flat bottom cars powered by production or race specific engines, although the latter would be restricted. IMSA came up with World Sports Car, but the difference between the two would be a bit like how LMP2 and DPI are today. But the WSC could run at Le Mans, and they did so in 1995. Also in 1994 GT1 arrived, but for Le Mans the ACO knew that teams would want to run prototypes at Le Mans instead of GTs, so they allowed these teams to dust off their old Group C cars and use them to fill the grid. LMP1, which was LMP Space 1, wouldn't be ready until 1996, and LMP2 wouldn't be on the grid until 1995. Without the prototypes, it would have just been GT1s, and nobody would have bothered. I will be calling them LMP1 throughout this video, but the LMP1s on the grid were actually labelled LMP1/C90, and these were the pre-1992 regulation Group C cars that had downforce and power nerfed slightly. Toyota went in full of confidence because Porsche wasn't bringing a factory team, Peugeot had turned their attention to Formula 1 and the BTCC, and Kramer and Courage didn't have the same budgets that Toyota did. Toyota decided they were going to cruise to victory, and then hired some misfits for the two cars and left their factory drivers in Japan and just let them have the weekend off. But what Toyota hadn't done was read the rulebook properly. Porsche, well more specifically Dauer, read the rulebook and came up with a cunning plan, and Porsche's interest peaked. GT1 was a bit like how GT3 is today, racing cars based off production Grand Tourers. And when the category started, it was mostly Porsche and Venturi cars, but then the Ferrari F40, Lotus Elise and Callaway Corvette also joined in. The rulebook effectively said, so long as there are 25 road legal versions of your car, you can run it in GT1. Dauer presented the idea they had to Porsche, and Porsche effectively said, how much do you need to get this done? They took a 962 and replaced the floor with a flat-bottomed one, and also tuned up the bodywork with carbon fibre and Kevlar to make it lighter and stronger. They added a second seat, leather upholstery and modified the bodywork to allow the car to carry a suitcase. Why? Because it was a requirement in the rules. A road legal car that had enough space to carry a suitcase in a compartment such as, the boot at the back. Dauer installed this boot in the passenger side of the cabin. And they also added hydraulic suspension because Germany has rules regarding the ride heights of cars. It was all very last minute, but the car passed all the relevant tests to make it road legal in Germany, and Porsche saw an opportunity to give the 962 one last hurrah. This new 962 kept the original engine of the Group C car, a water-cooled 3-litre flat 6 with 2 turbos, and because it was in the GT1 category, that engine was not subject to the same restrictions as the other recycled Group C cars. So it kept the same amount of downforce and only had to have GT1 engine restrictions put on. Without the restrictors, it was good for 720 horsepower and had a top speed of 251 miles an hour, which was claimed to be the fastest production car ever built up until the Bugatti Veyron arrived. And I should backtrack a little bit here, because while I said there were minimum build requirements of 25 cars, the FIA brought in a rule that said you could apply for GT1 without actually having built 25 cars. You could just build one road legal version of your car, or 0, apply for GT1 and basically go, we're going to build 25 of these. Really, you only needed a prototype or some other proof of concept, and it was so that Bugatti could enter the EB110 or McLaren bring in the F1. And while it all seems like a lot of effort, it was all for a good reason. GT1s were restricted to about 650 horsepower and about 120 litre fuel tanks, while the old Group Cs were restricted to 80 litres and had their power and downforce trimmed further. This new 962 had narrower tyres than it was used to running, but it had a larger fuel tank, and with help from Porsche they were able to offset the lack of straight line speed and cornering stability with the fact that they could spend less time in the pits. It was a bold strategy, Cotton, but it paid off for them because they were able to spend less time in the pits. The LMP1s around them either spent too much time breaking down or pitting because of their older machinery compared to the other GT1s. While the Dauers had qualified in 5th and 7th overall, the next GT1 was 20 seconds a lap slower, and they just climbed slowly up the field to first place. They did have an extra 40 litres of fuel on board, which gave them an extra 50 kilos in weight, but because they weren't as restricted as the LMP1s, they were capable of 352 around the lap, which was a second faster than what they'd done in qualifying. Toyota then realised that the Dauers had been sandbagging all along. The 962s destroyed the rest of their class. The next GT1 in the results was 12th, a Dodge Viper driven by Justin Bell, Rennie Arnoux and Bertrand Ballas, 71 laps behind. They beat the second place LMP1 by a lap, and the second Dauer was on the same lap as that Toyota, a Toyota that was driven by Eddie Irvine, Jeff Krosnoff and Mauro Martini. It was supposed to be Krosnoff, Martini and Roland Ratzenberger, but he was replaced by Irvine after Roland's death at Imola that year. But while it looks like it was very close and looked like a waste of time making this thing road legal to dodge the rulebook, if not for some issues, those Dauers would have most likely made mincemeat of the Toyotas. Bootson's car, while leading, had a puncture on the pit straight and had to do a full lap crawling round to get it fixed and lost 2 laps. That same car then ran out of fuel and needed to be pushed to the pit box later on. The other car blew a drive shaft and needed that repairing, and then Bootson lost his front bodywork in the night and needed that replacing because he couldn't see. The Toyotas lost an hour to repair a gearbox, but even before that, Bootson's car recovered one of the 2 laps due to the fact it could do 14 or 15 laps, while the LMP ones could only do 11 or so. But even more remarkably, Dauer ended up selling 12 or 13 road-going versions of this car after Le Mans, but there was outrage amongst the Le Mans competitors that the car had cheated its way to victory. But it hadn't. They'd actually complied to the letter of the law. But the ACO saw the point of the other competitors and made sure this never happened again. It was the last victory and last race for Group C in Europe, and the McLaren GT1 would win at Le Mans the following year. The last victory for a real 962 would be in the All Japan Grand Touring Car Championship in the August of 1994. So while the World Sports Car Championship ended in a whimper, Group C itself went out in style. So this has been the story of how Porsche loopholed their way to a Le Mans win in 1994. If you've learned something new here today, then be sure to like the video, and if you're not already, subscribe and get the bell on so you never miss out on a future video. Massive thanks to the people of Patreon for their continued support. If you do want to leave me a monthly tip, you can do so by following the link in the description, where you'll also find a link to Discord and also pointers to my socials. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. So goodbye.